Hey guys, welcome back to another WideAwakeHorror video. Today, we've got 14 craziest and most horrific dating horror stories that you'll ever hear. Now, before we tune in, please smash that like button if you enjoy the stories, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. And now, I want to try something new. I'm gonna narrate one of the stories, and you tell me what you think of it. If you like it, it stays. If you don't like it, Marcus takes over again. Thanks for listening. Now, to the stories. I still remember the exact moment I felt small around Emily. And it wasn't during a fight or anything dramatic. It was standing in line at a crowded mall food place. My brain half fried from noise and people when I made a random comment about the menu looking different than last year. She smiled at me in this soft, almost amused way, like I had just said something wrong but cute. Gently corrected me, not loud, not mean, just enough to make me feel off. I laughed it off. I didn't know that moment would replay in my head months later. I met Emily through college group project that turned into late nights at the library, the kind with buzzing lights, uncomfortable chairs, and the smell of old paper. She always seemed put together, even when everyone else looked exhausted. She spoke clearly, confidently. People listened when she talked. When she started paying attention to me, it felt flattering, like I had passed some unspoken test. Our first hangouts were study sessions that slowly turned into getting food afterwards. Nothing fancy, just walking, talking, killing time. Emily had this way of explaining things that made her sound calm and sure, like she always knew what she meant. I liked that. I tend to second guess myself, so being around someone so certain felt grounding. Early on, she'd correct little things. Not facts exactly, more like phrasing. If I told a story and mixed up the order, she'd gently rearrange it for me. If I explained how I felt about something, she'd reword it in a cleaner way. She said she liked clarity. I told myself she was just thoughtful. It started to happen in front of other people. I'd make a joke and she'd smile and say what I actually meant. I'd explain an opinion and she'd polish it out loud. Everyone would nod, and I'd feel this weird mix of embarrassment and gratitude. She wasn't mocking me, she was helping. At least, that's what I told myself. After a while, I noticed I talked less when she was around. Not because she told me to stop, but because I didn't want to be corrected again. Every sentence felt like it needed to be perfect before leaving my mouth. Emily never raised her voice, never rolled her eyes. She just adjusted me. When I brought it up once, carefully, she looked genuinely confused. She said she thought I liked when she helped me express myself better. She said she was just trying to make sure I didn't come across the wrong way. I felt stupid for even mentioning it. I apologized. Things got heavier after that. If I disagreed with her, she'd frame it like a misunderstanding. She'd explain my own thoughts back to me, slowly, calmly, until they sounded different than how I remembered feeling them. I tried to correct her, but she'd say I was getting defensive. That word stuck. Defensive. Every time I pushed back, that's what I became. Emily loved being around people. Friends, classmates, acquaintances. She thrived in group settings. I started to dread them. Every interaction felt like a performance. If I said something awkward, she'd fix it. If I stayed quiet, she'd mention later how withdrawn I seemed. It felt like there was no right way to exist around her. One night, we were sitting in her living room, watching something random on TV. I mentioned feeling overwhelmed lately. She paused the show and asked what I meant. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words like I always did. She listened, nodding, then calmly summarized what I was feeling, except it wasn't right. She made it sound like my stress was self-created, like I was choosing it. I remember sitting there thinking, that's not what I meant, but also wondering if she was right. That became a pattern. I started doubting my own reactions. If I felt hurt, I questioned whether I was being sensitive. If something bothered me, I wondered if I had misunderstood it. She'd say things like, she just wanted me to sound more confident, more mature, more secure, and I wanted that too, so I let her shape me. I adjusted my tone, changed how I told stories, filtered my opinions before sharing them. The worst part was how nice she sounded while doing it. If she had been cruel, it would have been easier to leave. But she wasn't. She sounded supportive, calm, concerned. Anytime I felt upset, she'd explain it away so smoothly that I felt silly for feeling it at all. I stopped talking to my friends about her. When I tried, I couldn't explain what was wrong. She didn't insult me. She didn't control where I went. She just made me feel like I needed help being myself. The moment everything cracked was small and stupid. We were at a small get-together, sitting on the floor with a few people, just talking. Someone asked my opinion about something simple. I answered honestly. Emily laughed lightly and corrected me, again. But this time, people noticed. Someone gave me a look, not judgment, but concern. Later that night, I told Emily it bothered me, really bothered me. She sighed and said she didn't realize I was so insecure about sounding smart. That hit me hard. She said she was just trying to support me and that my reaction made her feel unappreciated. Something shifted then. I realized every conversation somehow ended with me being the problem. Too sensitive, too defensive, too insecure. I started feeling tired all the time, like holding myself together took effort. The end didn't come with a big argument. It came during a quiet walk. I tried to explain that I felt like I was disappearing around her. She stopped walking and calmly explained that I was actually becoming a better version of myself. She said growth was uncomfortable. I didn't argue. I just felt done. Like I couldn't keep questioning my own thoughts anymore. I told her I needed space. Her face changed. Just slightly. She said she hoped I didn't regress. After that, we stopped talking. No drama, no closure talk, just distance. The silence felt strange at first. Then it felt light. It took a while for my thoughts to sound like mine again, for my opinions to feel solid. I still catch myself editing my words sometimes, wondering how they'll sound. But then I remember, I don't need permission to speak. Emily probably still thinks she helped me. Maybe she did in some way, but I know how quiet I became around her. And I know I don't want to feel that small again.
I keep thinking about how boring the night was when everything started, because that's what makes it worse. Nothing dramatic, no warning feeling, no moment where I should have known better. I was in my room half laying off my bed, half on it, scrolling through my phone while my charger barely reached the outlet. My window was cracked open because I hate when the air feels stuck. Michael sent a message that was simple and normal, and I answered without thinking twice. It felt like just another person drifting into my life, not something that would quietly mess with my head for months. I met Michael earlier that year at a small get-together that barely counted as a party. Someone brought a speaker, someone else brought snacks, and most of us didn't know why we were there. Michael wasn't loud or impressive. He didn't dominate the room. He just listened. When he talked to me, it felt calm, like I didn't need to fill the silence. He remembered little things and brought them up later in a way that made me feel noticed instead of studied. I remember thinking he felt safe. Our first hangout wasn't even called a date. We got food from a place near campus that always smelled like oil and cleaning spray. He paid without making it weird. I said thanks, and he said it was nothing. We sat outside because the inside was packed, and the whole thing felt easy. No pressure, no awkward pauses, just walking around afterward and talking about random stuff. When I got home, I didn't replay everything in my head like I usually did. I just went to sleep. After that, we started seeing each other more. Nothing intense. Just hanging out after class, grabbing food, walking around stores with no plan to buy anything. Every time Michael paid. I offered sometimes, but he always waved it off. He said he liked taking care of things. I thought that meant he was thoughtful. I didn't think deeper than that. The first time money came up in a way that stuck with me was during a casual comment. We were sitting in his car with the engine off, music low, just killing time. He mentioned how fast things add up when you go out a lot. He said it with a smile, like he was joking, but then listed a few prices. $18 here, $32 there. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. It didn't feel like a complaint, but it didn't feel like nothing either. After that, I started noticing it more. He would casually mention how much something cost. Not every time, but often enough that I became aware of it. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, almost proud, like he was keeping track of his effort and wanted me to see it too. I told myself I was reading too much into it, because he was still nice, still attentive, still doing all the things that looked good on the outside. Slowly, the vibe shifted. If I was tired or quiet, he pointed out. Not in a mean way, just as an observation. If I didn't sound excited enough, he'd ask if something was wrong. If I said I was fine, he'd remind me that he had planned the day or paid for everything. It always ended with me feeling slightly guilty, even if I couldn't explain why. One night, we were sitting at a diner that felt stuck in another decade. Cracked vinyl seats, buzzing lights, sticky menus. Michael pulled out his phone and showed me a note. It was a list. Dates, places, prices, food, tickets, gas. Everything totaled at the bottom. He explained that he liked keeping track so things stayed fair. He said relationships worked better when effort was balanced. His voice was steady, almost gentle. My stomach felt tight, but I laughed because I didn't want to make it weird. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about the list. Every interaction felt like it was being added to it. If I wanted to stay in instead of going out, I wondered how that looked on his invisible scale. If I wasn't in a great mood, I worried it counted against me. I started checking myself before reacting, making sure I sounded grateful enough, warm enough, interested enough. He started using words like effort and return. He'd say he didn't feel the same energy coming back. He never accused me outright. He just explained how things looked from his side. And somehow, I always ended up apologizing. Not because I knew what I did wrong, but because it felt easier than pushing back. I stopped bringing up things that bothered me. When I did, he calmly explained why my feelings didn't match the situation. He'd break it down logically, step by step, until I felt silly for even bringing it up. It wasn't that he said I was wrong. It was that he made it sound like the math didn't support me. I noticed changes in myself that scared me. I became quieter. I thought before every message. I replayed conversations after they happened, wondering if I sounded appreciative enough. I felt like I was constantly behind, like I was trying to catch up to a standard I didn't fully understand. There was a moment in a park that really stuck with me. We were sitting on a bench watching people walk past, kids running around, everything normal. Michael started talking about commitment in this serious, measured way. He said he needed to know I was serious because he couldn't keep investing without knowing the return. He said affection and reassurance were ways to show commitment. I nodded, even though my chest felt heavy. After that, everything felt conditional. Affection depended on my behavior. Patience depended on my response time. Kindness depended on how easy I was. If I needed space, it was framed as me pulling away. If I needed reassurance, it was framed as me asking for more when he already gave so much. The breaking point wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. I told him one night that I was exhausted and wanted to stay in. He came over anyway. He sat on my couch and opened his phone. The list was longer now. More dates, more totals. He talked about time, money, attention. He said he felt like he was carrying everything. He asked what I planned to do to balance it out. Something clicked then, not in a big movie moment way. Just a slow realization that this wasn't about generosity. It was about control. And even that felt hard to accept because he wasn't angry. He looked disappointed, calm, reasonable. I told him I couldn't do this anymore. My voice felt thin, but I didn't take it back. He closed his phone, stood up, and said it was my choice. He said choices had consequences. Then he left. No door slam. No big reaction. After he was gone, my place felt strange. Quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I sat there thinking about how close I came to staying just to avoid the guilt. How easy it would have been to keep shrinking myself to fit his balance. I didn't feel sad right away. I felt empty, like I had been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there until it was gone. Michael never reached out again. I didn't expect him to. What stayed with me wasn't him. It was a habit of measuring myself, the instinct to earn care instead of accepting it. That took longer to shake. I was sitting on the curb outside a closed convenience store at almost midnight when Daniel first crossed my mind in a way that felt wrong. Not missing him. Not angry. Just this sudden, heavy thought that maybe none of my reactions over the last few months had actually been mine. It hit me while my phone buzzed with random notifications and the streetlights hummed overhead. I remember thinking that was a weird place for clarity to show up. but that's how it happened. Daniel came into my life during a phase where everything felt scattered. I had just switched classes, my schedule was messy, and I was constantly behind on sleep. We met through a campus workshop that barely anyone wanted to attend. Folding chairs, bad lighting, a speaker who talked too long. Daniel sat a few seats away and kept nodding along like he was really focused. When we talked afterward, he asked questions that made it seem like he actually cared about the answers. He was calm in a way that felt grounding, not overly friendly, not distant, just steady. When he looked at you, it felt like he was actually listening instead of waiting to talk. I remember thinking he seemed mature, like he had his stuff together in a way most people didn't. After a few casual meetups, it felt natural to start hanging out one-on-one. We spent a lot of time walking, around campus, through neighborhoods, past places that were loud during the day and quiet at night. Daniel liked asking questions, deep ones, not in a creepy way, just curious. He wanted to know what stressed me out, what made me anxious, what I worried about when I couldn't sleep. I shared things I didn't usually say out loud. It felt relieving, like letting pressure out slowly. What stood out was how much he remembered. Tiny details. Things I had said once, weeks earlier. He'd bring them up casually, like it was normal to catalog someone like that. At first, it felt flattering, like it mattered enough to be noticed fully. I didn't realize how that memory would later turn into something else. Early on, Daniel framed everything as understanding. If I got upset, he'd want to know why. If I reacted strongly to something, he'd ask what it connected back to. He talked a lot about patterns, about how people repeat behaviors without realizing it. I liked that he wanted to understand me, even when it made conversations longer and heavier than I expected. The first time I felt uncomfortable, I ignored it. We were sitting on a bench near a building that stayed lit all night. I mentioned being annoyed by something small that had happened earlier that day. Daniel listened, nodded, then explained why my reaction made sense given my past stress. He connected it to something I had told him weeks before. It sounded logical, almost impressive, but it also felt like he was telling me what I felt instead of listening. After that, it started happening more often. Whenever I reacted to something, Daniel would trace it back to a cause. Not just a reason, but a pattern. He'd say things like this reaction was expected based on my background, or that my response fit a certain cycle. He never sounded judgmental, just observant, like a teacher explaining a concept. I started second-guessing myself. If I felt annoyed, I wondered if it was really about the situation or just something unresolved. If I felt sad, I questioned whether it was valid or just part of a pattern Daniel had already mapped out. Conversations slowly shifted from me sharing how I felt to him explaining why I felt that way. I didn't notice how much power that gave him at first. He framed it as helping me understand myself better. He said awareness was a first step to growth. Whenever I disagreed with his interpretation, he'd say that resistance was normal, that people often push back when confronted with truths about themselves. That word stuck with me. Resistance. It turned every disagreement into proof that he was right. If I said he misunderstood me, it meant I wasn't ready to see it yet. If I felt uncomfortable, it meant something was being triggered. Every path led back to his explanation. I remember one afternoon when we were supposed to hang out, but I canceled because I felt drained. Dana responded calmly, saying it made sense because avoidance was one of my coping habits. I stared at my phone for a long time after read that. I hadn't said I was avoiding him. I had said I was tired. But somehow he had turned it into another pattern. He encouraged me to open up more, so I did. I told him about family stuff, past relationships, moments I regretted. He listened closely, asked follow-up questions, and remembered everything. Later, those same details would come back during disagreements. Not as accusations, but as explanations for why my feelings weren't lining up with reality. It was subtle. That's what made it hard to explain. Daniel never told me I was wrong directly. He just explained me until my version of events felt messy and unreliable. His explanations were always smooth, calm, confident. He spoke like someone who had already figured things out. I started relying on him to tell me what I was feeling. If I felt off, I'd wait for him to analyze it. If something bothered me, I'd bring it up just to hear his take. My own reactions felt incomplete without his interpretation attached. That realization came later. The dependence built quietly. We spent more time together indoors when it got colder. His place was quiet, organized, neutral. Nothing personal on the walls. It felt controlled, safe. Conversations there always felt heavier, like the space itself encouraged overthinking. We'd sit for hours talking about emotions, reactions, habits. It was exhausting, but I told myself it was meaningful. There was a moment that stands out as a turning point. I mentioned feeling frustrated about something small. Daniel listened, then explained that my frustration wasn't actually about that situation. He traced it back through multiple layers of past stress, childhood patterns, and coping mechanisms. By the time he finished, the original issue barely mattered. I remember nodding, but inside I felt lost, like my feelings had been taken apart and rearranged into something unrecognizable. When I tried to steer the conversation back to the actual situation, he gently redirected it. He said focusing on surface issues avoided real growth. After that, I stopped trusting my first reactions. I'd assumed they were incomplete, wrong, influenced by things I hadn't processed yet. I leaned on Daniel's interpretations because they sounded solid, researched, logical. He spoke like someone who had read all the right books. Friends started noticing changes in me before I did. They said I sounded unsure, hesitant, like I was always explaining myself. I brushed it off. I told them Daniel was helping me understand myself better. Saying it out loud made it sound convincing. The tension built slowly. I felt smaller in conversations, less certain. Anytime I tried to assert how I felt, Daniel would explain why that feeling didn't align with my usual patterns. He'd say it wasn't bad, just interesting. But it always left me feeling like my perspective needed approval. The moment everything cracked wasn't loud. It was quiet and unsettling. We were walking through a nearly empty parking lot late at night. I mentioned feeling hurt by something he had said earlier. Daniel stopped walking and calmly explained why my hurt was misplaced. He connected it to insecurity, to past situations, to emotional habits. For the first time, I didn't nod. I felt this sudden frustration that didn't fade when he explained it. I told him that maybe he was overanalyzing everything. His face didn't change much. He said that was a common response when someone felt exposed. That sentence flipped something in my head. No matter what I said, it would become proof of his point. Disagreement meant denial. Discomfort meant growth. There was no way to just feel something without it being dissected. I realized then how tired I was. Tired of having my emotions turned into case studies. Tired of feeling like my reactions were always being graded. I wanted to feel something without needing a breakdown afterward. Ending things felt harder than it should have. Not because I still cared deeply, but because I doubted myself. I wondered if wanting to leave was just another pattern, another avoidance response, another thing Daniel could explain away.
Hey guys, really sorry to disturb you, but if you're enjoying the stories up until this point, please smash that like button. That's all I'm asking for you guys. Let's break some records this year. Now, back to the stories.
The thing about Olivia is that I trusted her way too fast, and not because she rushed me. It was because she made everything feel like it was my idea. I remember the exact setting when I started opening up to her more than I ever planned to. We were sitting on the steps outside a campus building that always stayed warm inside, even in winter. People were walking past, laughing, carrying backpacks, living their own lives, and somehow I felt like I was in this quiet bubble with her where nothing could go wrong. I met Olivia through a mutual friend who invited us both to a study group that never actually studied. Olivia showed up late, hair still damp like she had rushed out, apologizing in this soft way that immediately made people smile. She had this calm energy that made you want to lean in when she talked. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and present. When she asked how you were, it didn't feel like a filler question. We started talking one-on-one after that. At first, it was light. Classes, random complaints, jokes about how tired everyone always was. Then one night, while sitting on a bench near the library, she said something about how honesty mattered more than anything to her. She said it casually, like a personal rule she lived by. I nodded without thinking much about it. After that, she started asking deeper questions. Not all at once, spaced out. One I regretted, what I was insecure about, moments I wished I could redo. She shared things too, which made it feel fair. It didn't feel like a confession session. It felt like trust building. I remember thinking this was what being close to someone was supposed to feel like. We spent more time together after that, walking, sitting, talking for hours. Olivia listened closely. She remembered things. She'd bring them up later, not in a creepy way, just enough to show she cared. When I opened up, she'd nod and say it made sense. She validated everything I said. It felt good. It felt safe. The first time something felt off was so small I almost missed it. We were sitting in her living room, lights dim, some show playing in the background that neither of us was really watching. I mentioned something I regretted from the past. Nothing huge. Just something I wasn't proud of. Olivia listened quietly, then said she appreciated my honesty. Her tone was warm, reassuring. I relaxed. Weeks later, during a disagreement about something unrelated, she brought it up. Not aggressively, just casually. She said she understood why I reacted the way I did because of that past mistake I had told her about. My stomach dropped. I didn't even know how to respond. I hadn't expected that story to resurface like that. I told myself it was a coincidence, that she didn't mean it like that. But it kept happening. Anytime we disagreed, she gently tied my reaction back to something personal I had shared. Something vulnerable. Something I had trusted her with. She framed it like understanding, but it felt like being cornered. Olivia never raised her voice, never insulted me. She always sounded calm, reasonable. She'd say things like she wasn't blaming me, just pointing out patterns. She said honesty meant acknowledging how past mistakes shaped current behavior. Every time she said it, it sounded logical, mature, and every time I felt smaller. I started being more careful about what I shared. I avoided talking about certain things. Olivia noticed. She asked why I was closing off. She said it worried her. She said openness was important for trust. I felt guilty, like I was failing at being honest. When I tried to explain that it hurt when she used my past against me, she looked genuinely surprised. She said she wasn't using it against me. She said she was just connecting dots. She said ignoring context would be dishonest. Somehow, I ended up apologizing for misunderstanding her intentions. Things slowly turned heavy. Disagreements never stayed in the present. They always expanded outward, pulling in old stories, past regrets, moments I had shared late at night when I thought they were safe. I felt like every flaw I ever admitted to was now part of a file she could reference. Friends noticed I was quieter, more guarded. When they asked what was wrong, I didn't know how to explain it. Saying she was honest sounded like a good thing. Saying she remembered everything sounded like a compliment. I didn't have the words for why it felt bad. There was one argument that really stuck with me. It wasn't even about something serious. I had canceled plans because I felt overwhelmed. Olivia said she understood, but later mentioned how my inconsistency probably came from a mistake I had told her about months earlier. She said it gently, like she was offering insight. I felt exposed, like my present choice had been stripped of context and replaced with a story I didn't get to control. I started questioning myself constantly. If I felt upset, I wondered if I was just repeating old habits. If I felt hurt, I wondered if I deserved it. Olivia never said I was wrong outright. She just explained me until my feelings didn't feel solid anymore. The scariest part was how much I still cared about her approval. She was warm when things were good, affectionate, supportive. It made the hard moments feel like my fault. Like if I just communicated better or healed more, everything would be fine. One night, we were sitting in her car, parked outside her place. The air was cold, windows fogged. I tried to explain that I felt like my past was being held over me. She listened quiet. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said accountability didn't disappear just because time passed. She said growth meant owning your patterns. I remember staring at the dashboard, feeling tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. I didn't want to be perfect. I just wanted to be allowed to mess up without it becoming evidence. After that, I pulled back emotionally. Olivia noticed immediately. She said she felt me distancing. She asked if I was hiding something. The question itself made me uneasy. It felt like there was no safe amount of openness anymore. The end didn't happen in one moment. It happened slowly. Fewer messages, shorter hangouts, more silence. When I finally told her I couldn't keep doing this, she looked hurt but calm. She said she hoped I wouldn't repeat old patterns by avoiding hard conversations. Hearing that made something inside me snap. I realized that no matter how I left, it would be framed as part of my past mistakes. There was no clean exit, so I chose the quiet one. After we stopped talking, I felt this strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that my words were mine again. Grief for how close I thought we were. It took time to stop filtering my thoughts, to stop wondering how they might be used later. I don't think Olivia thought she was doing anything wrong. I think she genuinely believed honesty meant total access. But I learned something important from being with her. Not everything you share stays gentle in the wrong hands. I still believe in honesty, just not the kind that keeps receipts. I was halfway through a burnt slice of toast when Lucas sent the message that should have tipped me off, but didn't. My kitchen smelled like smoke, my phone was sticky from jam, and I was already late for class. The message wasn't dramatic. It was something like asking how I slept and whether I felt centered today. That word stuck out, but I ignored it. I just wanted to get through the morning. I had no idea that for the next few months, almost every emotion I had would be examined like that. I met Lucas at a gym I barely went to. I usually avoided talking to anyone there, but he asked me to spot him one day, and somehow that turned into a conversation that lasted longer than the workout. He talked slowly, like he chose every word on purpose. He asked thoughtful questions, nodded a lot, and didn't interrupt. He mentioned therapy casually, like it was just another hobby. I remember thinking he seemed emotionally aware, like someone who had done the work. We started seeing each other outside the gym. Coffee walks, sitting in my car talking because neither of us felt like going home yet. Lucas talked a lot about communication, about being intentional, about understanding feelings instead of reacting to them. It sounded healthy. It sounded mature. Compared to past people I had dated, he felt different. Early on, he complimented me for being expressive. He said he appreciated that I could talk about my feelings. When I got annoyed or stressed, he'd listen carefully, then reflect back what I said. It felt validating at first, like finally someone was hearing me instead of brushing things off. The shift happened slowly, like most bad things do. If I sounded frustrated, he'd comment on my tone. Not in an angry way, just observational. He'd say things like my tone sounded defensive or closed off. If I said I was fine, he'd say my body language suggested otherwise. I laughed about it first. Maybe it was just perceptive. After a while, it felt like every feeling I had needed to be justified. If I was upset, Lucas wanted to unpack it immediately. He'd say letting things sit was unhealthy. Sometimes I just wanted to feel annoyed and move on, but he'd insist we talk it through. Not arguing, just processing. Hours of processing. He had this way of agreeing with me while still correcting me. He'd say my feelings were valid, then explain why the reaction itself wasn't productive. He talked about emotional regulation a lot, about how reactions could harm connection. Somehow, every conversation ended with me feeling like I needed to do better. I noticed that when he messed up, the conversations were shorter. He'd acknowledge it, explain his intention, and then say he hoped I didn't dwell on it. When I messed up, it turned into a deep dive. What triggered it? What belief it came from? How I could respond differently next time. I started feeling monitored. Not watched exactly, but evaluated. If I laughed too loudly, he'd comment on the energy shift. If I went quiet, he'd ask what was happening internally. There was no neutral state. Everything meant something. One night, we were sitting in his living room, lights low, just talking. I mentioned feeling overwhelmed lately. He nodded and said overwhelm often shows up when someone avoids addressing deeper issues. I asked what he meant. He launched into this calm explanation about my habits, my stress patterns, my emotional responses. By the end, I didn't even remember what had made me overwhelmed in the first place. I started preparing for conversations before they happened, rehearsing how to say things in a way that wouldn't turn into a long analysis. I softened my words, minimized my reactions. I didn't want another discussion about tone or delivery. Lucas framed everything as growth. If I pushed back, he'd say growth feels uncomfortable. If I said I didn't want to talk about something, he'd say avoidance blocks intimacy. It felt like there was no option that didn't make me the problem. Friends noticed I was distracted, that I overexplained everything. When they asked what was going on, I didn't know how to answer. Saying someone was emotionally aware sounded positive. Saying someone cared about communication sounded healthy. I didn't have the language to explain why I felt drained. There was a moment that really stuck with me. We were out getting food, standing in line, nothing serious. I made a small comment about being tired. Lucas tilted his head and said tiredness can sometimes mask resentment. I laughed awkwardly and said I was just tired. He smiled and said we could explore it later if I wanted. I felt this weird drop in my stomach, like even being tired wasn't allowed to be simple. Arguments weren't loud. They were calm, structured. He'd sit back, speak slowly, and guide the conversation. I tried to explain how I felt, and he'd reframe it in more precise language. Sometimes he'd tell me what I was actually feeling, based on my behavior. When I disagreed, he'd say I might not be fully aware yet. I started doubting my instincts. If something felt off, I wondered if I was being reactive. If I felt hurt, I questioned whether it was justified. Lucas always sounded so sure, so grounded. It made my uncertainty feel like a flaw. The breaking point came on a random afternoon. I had a rough day and told him I didn't have the energy to talk much. He said he understood, then added that emotional withdrawal can damage trust. I snapped, not yelling, just firm. I said sometimes I just needed quiet without it meaning something deeper. He went quiet for a moment, then said my reaction showed resistance to vulnerability. Hearing that made something click. No matter what I said, it would be turned into a diagnosis. There was no way to just exist without being analyzed. I went home that night feeling exhausted, not sad, not angry, just empty. I thought about how light I used to feel before every emotion became a project. How I used to laugh without wondering what it signaled. How I used to be annoyed without needing a full breakdown. When I told Lucas I needed space, he nodded calmly. He said he respected my choice, but hoped I wouldn't confuse comfort with health. That sentence followed me for days. I replayed it over and over, wondering if I was making a mistake. But the space felt good, quiet, uncomplicated. My feelings came back without footnotes. I didn't need permission to be tired or annoyed or happy, and just was. We didn't end things dramatically, we just stopped talking. No big conversation. No closure. I think Lucas believed he was helping me grow. Maybe with someone else he would, but with me it felt like I was shrinking. I don't think emotional awareness is bad. I just learned that when someone uses it like a rule book, it stops being supportive. It becomes control wrapped in calm words. The first thing I noticed about Hannah was the rules, even though she never called them that. I was sitting on the edge of my bed with my shoes still on, backpack dumped on the floor, phone buzzing nonstop because I had ignored it all day. When I finally checked it, there was a long message from her explaining how she felt about something I hadn't even realized was an issue yet. It wasn't angry, it was structured. Bullet point structured, even without bullets. That should have told me something. I met Hannah at a part-time job I hated but needed. Fluorescent lights, stiff uniforms, fake smiles. She had been there longer than me and knew how to do everything fast without looking rushed. She corrected people confidently and didn't apologize for it. When she talked, she sounded certain, like she trusted her own opinions completely. I admired that at first. I've always been someone who second-guesses myself. We started talking during breaks, sitting on overturned crates behind the building because there was nowhere else to go. She complained about people who didn't meet her standards. Coworkers, friends, strangers. She said she just expected a lot from people and didn't see why that was a bad thing. I remember nodding along thinking it made sense. When we started seeing each other outside of work, Hannah was clear about what she wanted. Consistency, communication, reassurance. She said she had been hurt before and didn't tolerate uncertainty anymore. It sounded honest, mature. I told myself clarity was a good thing. The early days were intense, but not in a dramatic way. She texted a lot. Wanted updates. Wanted to know when I got home, when I woke up, what my plans were. She framed it as caring, checking in, making sure we were connected. I liked feeling wanted, so I didn't question it. The first time jealousy came up, it was subtle. I mentioned hanging out with friends, and she asked who would be there. I listed names. She paused, then said she trusted me, but not everyone else. She said it calmly, like a fact. I reassured her without thinking twice. After that, reassurance became a requirement. If I didn't respond fast enough, she'd ask if something was wrong. If I sounded tired, she'd ask if I was annoyed with her. Every question ended with me proving something. Proving I cared. Proving I wasn't pulling away. She started explaining her reactions as standards. She said she held herself to them too, that she expected consistency and emotional presence. If I failed to meet them, it wasn't her being insecure, it was me not showing up properly. The way she said it made it sound reasonable. I noticed I was adjusting my behavior, checking my phone constantly, or reading messages before sending them, making sure I sounded enthusiastic enough. When I forgot to update her about something small, she'd say it made her feel unimportant. I apologized every time. There was a night that really stands out. I went to sleep early because I was exhausted. My phone was on silent. When I woke up, there were multiple messages. Not angry, but detailed. She explained how not hearing from me triggered feelings of uncertainty. She said if I respected her, I would communicate better. I felt awful. I apologized, even though part of me felt like sleeping shouldn't be a mistake. After that, I stopped silencing my phone, even when I needed rest, even when I was with other people. I didn't want another message like that. Hannah said she appreciated the effort. She said it showed growth. Arguments weren't loud. They were emotional in a controlled way. She'd explain how my actions affected her sense of security. She used words like standards and expectations a lot. Anytime I tried to explain my side, she'd say I was deflecting. That word stuck. Deflecting. It made me feel like my reasons didn't count. She framed jealousy as awareness. She said caring meant paying attention. If something bothered her, it was because she valued the relationship. When I asked for more trust, she said trust had to be maintained through consistent behavior. I started feeling like I was always on probation, like one mistake can set us back. I didn't feel relaxed anymore. Being with her felt like a responsibility. I was always managing her feelings, making sure nothing triggered her insecurity. Friends started commenting that I seemed stressed. I brushed it off. I said Hannah just had high standards. Saying it out loud made it sound like a compliment. The turning point came during a weekend I spent with my family. My signal was bad, and I couldn't text much. Hannah sent messages explaining how distant I felt. When I finally called her, she said my lack of communication showed where my priorities were. She said if she mattered, I would have tried harder. I remember sitting alone in my childhood room, staring at the wall, feeling this mix of guilt and frustration. I hadn't done anything wrong, but I felt like I had failed a test I didn't agree to take. When I told her I felt overwhelmed by the constant reassurance, she got quiet. Then she said her standards were negotiable. She said lowering them would mean betraying herself. Hearing that made everything feel final. I realized then that there was no version of me that could relax in this relationship. No version that didn't feel monitored. No version that could just exist without proving something. And it wasn't dramatic. I told her I couldn't meet her expectations anymore. She said she wasn't surprised. She said people often say that when they don't want to do the work. That hurt, but it also clarified things. After we stopped talking, the silence felt strange at first. My phone felt lighter. I slept better. I stopped checking notifications every few minutes. I realized how tense I had been without noticing. It took time to stop apologizing automatically, to stop feeling guilty for needing space, to stop equating reassurance with respect. Hannah probably still believes she was just asking for the bare minimum. Maybe for someone else, it would be. But for me, it felt like I was always falling short of a moving target. I learned that standards can turn into cages when they leave no room for being human. The first thing that comes to mind when I think about Ryan is the blue glow of my phone lighting up my face at 3 in the morning. Not because something bad had happened, but because I felt this pressure to answer even though I was half asleep. My room was quiet, my fan clicking like it always did, and I remember staring at the ceiling, wondering why ignoring a message for a few hours suddenly felt like a moral failure. I met Ryan during a random stretch of weeks where nothing felt stable. Classes were uneven, my sleep schedule was wrecked, and I felt like I was always catching up to my own life. He was introducing me through a friend at a casual hangout that didn't really have a purpose. Someone's live room, cheap snacks, people scrolling on their phones instead of talking. Ryan sat next to me and started a conversation like it had already been going for a while. No awkward intro, just jumped in. He was easy to talk to. Not intense, not quiet, just present. He laughed at the same dumb stuff I did. He asked questions but didn't pry. When the night ended, he messaged me right away saying he had a good time. It felt nice. Simple. I didn't overthink it. We started talking more after that. Texting throughout the day, sending random updates, nothing serious. Ryan was big on checking in. He'd ask how my morning was, how class went, what I was doing later. At first, it felt caring, like someone actually wanted to know about the small parts of my day. When we started hanging out one-on-one, it stayed light. Walks, late-night food runs, sitting in the car listening to music. He talked a lot about trust, about how important it was to feel secure with someone. He said he valued openness more than anything. I agreed without really thinking about what that meant. The location sharing idea came up casually. We were talking about safety, about how unpredictable things could be, and Ryan suggested it might be good to know where each other was sometimes. He said it wasn't about control, just peace of mind. I hesitated for a second, then agreed. It didn't feel like a big deal. At first, it wasn't. Nothing changed right away. Then little comments started slipping in. He'd ask why I was still at a certain place. He'd mentioned noticing I took a different route home. He'd ask who I was with, always framed as curiosity or concern. I answered without thinking. I didn't want to seem secretive. The questions became more frequent. Not aggressive. Just constant. If I stayed somewhere longer than expected, he'd check in. If I went out without mentioning it beforehand, he'd ask about it later. Every question came with a soft tone, like he was just trying to understand. Ryan started needing reassurance more often. He'd ask if we were okay, if I still felt the same, if he had done something wrong. At first, I reassured him easily. I liked him. I wanted him to feel secure, but it never seemed to last. If I took longer to respond, he'd say he worried I was pulling away. If I said I needed space, he'd say he understood, but that explained how distance made him anxious. Every boundary turned into a conversation about his feelings. I found myself explaining my need for space like it was something I had to justify. He framed everything as communication. He said healthy relationships talk things through. So we talked. A lot. Late at night. When I was tired. When I wanted to sleep. When my phone buzzed and I felt that familiar pressure to respond immediately. I started feeling like I had to be available all the time. Emotionally. Mentally. Physically present through my phone. If I missed a message, I'd wake up to a long explanation about how it made him feel disconnected. Not angry. Disappointed. There was a night I remember clearly. I was out with friends and left my phone in my bag for a while. When I checked it later, there were multiple messages asking if I was okay. Then messages explaining how being unreachable made him spiral. I felt guilty even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I tried to explain that I couldn't always be on my phone. Ryan said he understood, but then asked what I could do to help him feel more secure. That question stuck with me. It shifted responsibility in a way I didn't notice right away. After that, I checked my phone constantly. During conversations. During class. Before sleeping. I didn't want to be the reason he felt anxious. He thanked me for being understanding. Said it meant a lot that I cared enough to reassure him. Slowly, my world started shrinking. Not because he told me not to see people, but because it felt easier to avoid situations where I couldn't respond quickly. I started planning my time around availability. I didn't realize how much until it became normal. When I finally brought up how drained I felt, Ryan looked hurt. He said he thought we were building something strong. He said needing reassurance didn't mean he was controlling. It meant he cared deeply. He said relationships took effort. I didn't know how to respond. Everything he said sounded reasonable. Who doesn't want someone who cares? Who doesn't want open communication? But something about it felt off. I just couldn't explain it yet. Arguments became circular. I'd say I felt overwhelmed. He'd say he felt insecure. I'd reassure him. Nothing changed. Every solution involved me giving more time, more attention, more reassurance. The breaking point came on a night when I told him I needed a quiet evening alone. He said he understood, then followed it with a message explaining how alone time made him feel distant from me. He said he hoped I wasn't using space to avoid connection. I stared at my phone for a long time. I felt tired in a deep way, not just physically, but mentally, like I was always managing someone else's emotions before my own. When I told him I couldn't keep doing this, he said he felt blindsided. He said he had been open about his needs from the beginning. He said he just wanted reassurance. He asked why that was so hard for me. I didn't have a clean answer. I just knew I felt trapped by constant availability, like my presence was being measured by response times and check-ins. Ending things was messy, not dramatic, just heavy. He kept asking if there was anything he could do differently. I didn't know how to explain that it wasn't about adjusting behavior. It was about how everything revolved around managing his insecurity. After we stopped talking, the silence felt loud at first. Then it felt freeing. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes. I went out without thinking about signal. I slept without interruptions. It took time to stop feeling guilty for not responding right away, to remind myself that needing space wasn't abandonment. That care didn't mean constant access. Ryan probably still believed he was just asking for reassurance. Maybe he was, but for me, it felt like my attention was never enough. Like no matter how present I was, it still needed proof. I learned that concern can turn into pressure when it has no off switch. I didn't realize I was part of a story until I overheard my own life being summarized in someone else's words. Not directly, not quoted, just reshaped. It happened in a loud coffee shop where the espresso machine screamed every few seconds, and the floor was always sticky. I was sitting 2 tables away, half focused on my phone, half zoning out, when I heard Megan's voice carrying over the noise. She was talking about a relationship that sounded way too familiar. The details weren't exact, but the shape of it was mine. That's when my stomach dropped. I met Megan at a creative meetup that I only went to because my friend bailed last minute and I didn't want to waste the bus ride. It was held in this cramped space above a bookstore with folding chairs and mismatched lamps. Everyone there wanted to be interesting. Megan didn't try. She just talked like she was already being listened to. She had this confidence that wasn't loud, just steady. When she asked what I did, she actually waited for the answer. We talked after the meetup, then again online, then in person. It flowed easily. She was funny in a dry way. Observant, she remembered small details and brought them up later like it was nothing. She also talked a lot about growth, about learning from relationships, about sharing lessons so other people didn't make the same mistakes. I thought it was thoughtful. I didn't realize I was being added to a collection. When we started seeing each other more seriously, Megan was very open about documenting her life. Not journaling privately, but sharing. She posted a lot. Thoughts, reflections, lessons. She said it helped her process. She said it helped others too. I nodded along, not thinking much of it. I didn't see myself as content. Early on, she'd say things like this reminded her of something she once wrote about. Or this could be a good example of communication done right. It felt flattering at first, like our connection mattered enough to be meaningful beyond us. Then she started telling me about reactions other people had. Friends messaging her saying they related. People thanking her for sharing. She'd say it casually like background noise. I didn't ask what exactly she shared. I assumed it was vague. The first time I felt weird was when she repeated something I had said in private, but reworded it. Framed it as insight. We were sitting in her room scrolling on our phones, and she mentioned how people sometimes struggle with expressing needs because of fear of rejection. She said it while looking at me smiling. It was something I had told her almost word for word a week earlier. I laughed it off. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe everyone feels that way. But then it happened again. A story, a feeling, a reaction. All things I had shared in moments I thought were just ours. I started noticing patterns. We have a disagreement or a deep talk, and a day or two later she posts something reflective. Not naming names. Not obvious. But specific enough that if you knew, you knew. She'd show me comments sometimes. People agreeing. People analyzing. It made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. When I brought it up gently, she looked surprised. She said she never shared details. She said she anonymized everything. She said if I saw myself in it, maybe it was because it resonated. She said stories are universal. I felt silly for questioning it. But the feeling didn't go away. I started holding back during conversations, editing myself, thinking about how my words might look once filtered through her voice. It felt like being constantly recorded even when no phone was out. Megan talked a lot about transparency. She said secrecy ruined trust. When I became quieter, she asked what was wrong. I told her I felt uncomfortable being turned into a lesson. She laughed softly and said she would never do that. She said I was projecting. After that, she started framing my discomfort as shame. She said sometimes people don't like seeing themselves reflected honestly. She said growth requires facing uncomfortable truths. I didn't know how to argue with that without sounding defensive. We went to a small event together one night. Someone recognized her from her posts. They talked about how much they loved her honesty, how brave she was. Megan smiled and thanked them. I stood there feeling invisible, like my private moments had been repurposed into something public. Later that night, I asked her again to stop sharing things that involved me. She said she already did. She said her stories were about her perspective, not mine. She said she couldn't censor her growth for someone else's comfort. That sentence stuck with me. After that, I noticed how often she referenced our relationship as material. Not directly, but conceptually. She'd say things like this was such a learning moment. Or this would be a good example of emotional labor. It felt like everything had a second purpose beyond us. I started pulling away without meaning to, being less open, more surface level. Megan noticed immediately. She said she felt me closing off. She asked if I was afraid of vulnerability. I didn't know how to explain that vulnerability didn't feel safe when it might be shared. The moment that broke me was small and quiet. We were at that same coffee shop from earlier, sitting across from each other, phones out. She was scrolling, smiling at something. She said someone had messaged her saying they felt seen by her latest post. She described it briefly. It was about a partner who struggled with boundaries. It was me, not named, not obvious, but undeniably me. I felt exposed in a way I had never felt before, like my inner life had been turned into a case study for strangers. When I told her it hurt, she went still. Then she said she was disappointed. She said she thought I supported her voice. She said she didn't realize I wanted to control how she expressed herself. That flipped everything. My boundary became control. My discomfort became insecurity. She said if I trusted her, I wouldn't feel threatened. I didn't know how to respond to that without unraveling. After that conversation, something shut down in me. I stopped sharing anything that mattered. I didn't want to give her more material. Our time together felt hollow, polite, careful. Ending things felt inevitable by then. When I told her I couldn't continue, she looked sad but composed. She said she hoped I would reflect on why I struggled with being seen. Hearing that made me feel like I had been misunderstood on purpose. After we stopped talking, I felt this mix of relief and paranoia. Relief that my words were mine again. Paranoia that pieces of me were still out there, reshaped, interpreted by people who didn't know me. It took a while to feel safe opening up again, to trust that private meant private. I still hesitate sometimes, wondering who might be listening beyond the room. Megan probably still believes she was just sharing her truth. Maybe she was. But I learned that someone else's platform doesn't need to come at the cost of my privacy. I was standing in the shower when it finally hit me, not in a dramatic way, just this dull realization that I was talking to the walls more honestly than I talked to her. The water was barely warm, the bathroom fan rattled like it always did, and I caught myself explaining my day out loud just to hear it make sense. That's when I realized how long it had been since Laura actually let me finish a thought. I met Laura at a mutual friend's small housewarming thing that barely felt planned. People were sitting on the floor, shoes piled near the door, music too quiet to commit to. Laura was leaning against the kitchen counter, listening more than talking. When she did speak, everyone paused. She had that calm presence that made it seem like what she said mattered. We started talking near the fridge because it was the only place with space. She asked thoughtful questions, not rapid fire, just enough to show she cared. When I talked about feeling overwhelmed with life stuff, she nodded and said she valued emotional honesty. She said it mattered more than pretending everything was fine. That stuck with me. Our early hangouts felt safe, like I didn't need to perform. We'd sit in coffee shops or walk aimlessly talking about stress, expectations, the pressure to have things figured out. Laura shared her own struggles in a way that felt balanced. It didn't feel one-sided. It felt like mutual support. She often said vulnerability was important to her, that she wanted someone who could talk about feelings instead of avoiding them. I like that. I had always struggled with keeping things bottled up, so it felt refreshing to be encouraged to open up. The first time I noticed something off was when I actually did open up. We were sitting in her living room, lights dim, some random show playing quietly. I told her I felt frustrated about something small, just a long day piling up. She listened quietly, then went distant. Not angry, just close. I asked if something was wrong. She said she needed space to process. I apologized, even though I wasn't sure why. I told myself everyone processes differently. After that, it became a pattern. Whenever I expressed frustration or discomfort, Laura would withdraw. She'd say she felt overwhelmed by negativity. She'd say she needed time to regulate. I tried to be understanding. I didn't want to pressure her. But it started to feel one-sided. When she vented, I listened. I reassured her. I stayed present. When I needed the same, she pulled back. Days would pass with shorter messages, less warmth. When I asked about it, she'd say she was protecting her peace. She framed it as self-care. She said she had learned not to absorb other people's emotions. She said she needed boundaries to feel safe. I didn't want to be someone who crossed boundaries, so I started holding things in. I noticed I'd say things like it's fine, or it's not a big deal even when it was. I didn't want to trigger another withdrawal. I didn't want to feel like my feelings were too much. When I tried to explain that it hurt when she shut down, she said she wasn't shutting down. She said she was taking space to avoid conflict. She said my need to talk things through immediately made her feel pressured. Somehow, my honesty became urgency. My frustration became negativity. My needs became something she had to protect herself from. There was a night that really stuck with me. We were supposed to hang out, but I had a rough day and said I might be a bit low energy. She replied hours later saying she didn't feel emotionally available to handle that. She said maybe we should reschedule. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling rejected for being honest. After that, I stopped mentioning bad days. I kept things light, surface level. Jokes. Updates that didn't ask for anything back. Laura seemed happier then, more affectionate, more present. It was hard not to notice the difference. Friends started asking why I never complained anymore. I laughed it off. I said things were fine, but inside it felt like I was carrying everything alone. There was a moment in her living room where it all came to a head. I had been holding things in for weeks, small resentments, little hurts. I finally tried to explain how lonely I felt sometimes. I spoke carefully, calmly. I didn't accuse her of anything. She listened, then her face changed. Not angry, tired. She said she felt overwhelmed. She said she couldn't handle being responsible for someone else's emotions. She said she needed a partner who was emotionally self-sufficient. That word stuck. Self-sufficient, like needing support, was a flaw. I told her I wasn't asking her to fix anything. I just wanted to be heard. She said listening still took emotional labor. She said she had to protect herself from burnout. After that conversation, she barely reached out. When I checked in, she said she was focusing on herself. I respected it outwardly, but inside I felt like I had been quietly pushed away for being honest. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was too much, if my feelings were unreasonable, if expecting mutual support was asking too much. The end didn't come with a fight. It came with distance. Days between messages, canceled plans, polite conversations that didn't go anywhere. When I finally asked where we stood, she said she didn't think we were compatible emotionally. She said she needed someone lighter. Lighter, that word hurt more than I expected. After we stopped talking, I felt this strange emptiness. Not heartbreak exactly, more like confusion. I had done what she asked. I had been vulnerable. I had given space, and somehow that still wasn't right. It took time to realize that emotional safety goes both ways, that protecting your peace shouldn't mean abandoning someone when they're honest. I started talking more openly with friends again, letting myself complain, letting myself be human. I still think Laura believed she was doing the right thing. She talked a lot about boundaries and self-care. Those aren't bad things, but when they only work one way, they stop being healthy. Sometimes I still catch myself hesitating before sharing how I feel, waiting for the withdrawal. Then I remember not everyone disappears when things get heavy. I'd remember the sound of my alarm more than anything else, because that's when I started feeling like I couldn't do anything without thinking of him first. It was this cheap buzzing noise that always made me reach for my phone half asleep, and every morning I'd check messages before even sitting up. Not because I wanted to, but because I felt like if I didn't, I'd already be doing something wrong. Andrew didn't ask for that directly, which somehow made it worse. I met Andrew at a volunteer event I signed up for last minute to pad my schedule. It was held in a community center that smelled like cleaning spray and old carpet. Everyone was awkward at first, standing around pretending to know what they were doing. Andrew stepped in naturally, organizing people without sounding bossy. He joked about fairness, about everyone doing their part. It made people laugh. It made him seem grounded. We started talking while stacking supplies. He talked a lot about values, about equality, about how relationships should be balanced and intentional. I liked how sure he sounded. It felt refreshing after dealing with people who avoided serious conversations. When he asked for my number, it didn't feel rushed. It felt thought out. Our early hangouts were structured in a way I didn't notice at first. He always suggested plans that felt productive. Walks with purpose. Meals with conversation topics. Nothing spontaneous, but I told myself that meant he cared. He talked about alignment a lot. How important it was to be on the same page. Andrew liked to test ideas. He'd bring up hypothetical situations and ask what I'd do. If my answer didn't line up with his values, he'd smile and say it was interesting. Not wrong, just interesting. He said he liked learning how people thought. Slowly, those hypotheticals became real. If I made a decision without telling him, he'd ask why. Not accusing, just curious. He'd say partnerships worked best with transparency. If I went somewhere on my own, he'd say he wished I had included him in the decision-making process. He framed it as teamwork. I noticed I started explaining myself more. Not because he demanded it, but because it felt expected. If I didn't justify a choice, he'd point out how it affected alignment. That word came up constantly. Alignment. It sounded harmless, but it carried weight. Andrew praised independence in theory. He talked about strong individuals choosing each other. But when I actually acted independently, it became a discussion. He'd ask whether my choice reflected shared values, whether it considered the relationship, whether it showed maturity. There was one afternoon when I decided to rearrange my schedule without mentioning it. Nothing major, just shifting things around. When I told him later, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said decisions like that could create distance if not communicated properly. I apologized even though I wasn't sure why. After that, I started checking in before doing things. Not asking permission, but seeking approval. It happened gradually. I phrased things carefully, making sure my choices sounded reasonable. He'd nod and say he appreciated the consideration. Arguments were strange. Calm, almost academic. Andrew would never raise his voice. He'd sit back and explain his perspective like he was presenting a case. If I got emotional, he'd say he preferred to focus on logic. He said emotions could cloud good decision-making. When I tried to explain how something made me feel, he'd redirect the conversation to outcomes. How my reaction affected the relationship. How it reflected on our alignment. Feelings became secondary to principles. He liked to frame disagreements as growth opportunities. He'd say conflict revealed where work was needed. Somehow the work always seemed to be mine. I needed to be more flexible, more communicative, more aligned. I started feeling like I was being graded, like every choice added up to some unspoken evaluation. When he complimented me, it was often about how well I handled the situation, how mature my response was. It felt less like affection than more like feedback. Friends noticed I talked differently, more carefully, like I was defending a thesis instead of sharing a story. When they asked about Andrew, I said he valued equality. Saying it out loud made it sound good, even when it didn't feel that way. The pressure built quietly. I stopped doing things on impulse. I stopped trusting my instincts. Every decision went through a filter of whether it would make sense to him. I didn't realize how much until I felt anxious doing something as small as choosing where to eat. There was a conversation that stands out more than the rest. I told him I felt like I couldn't make choices without explaining them. He listened, nodding. Then he said independence didn't mean acting without considering consequences. He said real partnership required accountability. He said my discomfort might come from resisting responsibility. That flipped something in me. Suddenly, my need for autonomy was framed as immaturity. My frustration was framed as avoidance. I felt trapped in language that always made him sound reasonable and me sound lacking. The breaking point came during a weekend when I decided to spend time alone. I told him ahead of time, explained why. He said he understood. Later, he sent a long message about how solo time could sometimes be a way to disengage from shared growth. He said he hoped I was still committed to alignment. I stared at my phone for a long time. I felt exhausted in a way I couldn't explain. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I constantly felt like I was close to it. When I told him I needed space from the relationship, he didn't argue. He said he respected my choice. Then he added that he hoped I'd reflect on whether I was choosing comfort over growth. That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted. After we stopped seeing each other, the quiet felt strange, unsettling at first, then freeing. I made decisions without running them through someone else's framework. I did things just because I wanted to. No explanation needed. It took time to stop overthinking, to stop preparing defenses for choices no one was questioning anymore. I didn't realize how heavy the mental load had been until it was gone. Andrew probably still believes he values equality. Maybe he does in his own way. But I learned that when values become rules, they stop being shared. They become tools. I was eating cold cereal straight from the box when Jason sent the voice note that finally made me pause. Not because it was angry or emotional, but because it sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced it a few times before hitting send. I remember standing in my kitchen, spoon in hand, listening to him talk about understanding and patterns and growth, and realizing I felt more confused than comforted. That moment didn't end things, but it planted a seed I couldn't ignore. I met Jason through a mutual friend at a random outdoor event that felt thrown together last minute. Folding tables, string lights that barely worked, people pretending they knew each other better than they did. Jason stood out because he looked slightly uncomfortable, like he didn't quite fit but was trying. He made self-aware jokes about being awkward. People laughed. I did too. We talked for a long time that night. He told me about how misunderstood he felt by people in his past, how he was sensitive and thoughtful but often labeled difficult. I remember feeling bad for him. He talked about how deeply he felt things, how often people dismissed him. It made me want to be careful with him. Our early conversations were heavy in a way that felt meaningful. Jason liked to talk about emotions, about how past experiences shaped people. He shared stories that sounded vulnerable, moments where he felt hurt or overlooked. He said he valued honesty above all else. I told myself this was depth, not a warning sign. When we started spending more time together, he framed himself as someone who had done a lot of reflection. He said he had learned from previous relationships, that he understood his triggers now, that he just wanted mutual understanding. It sounded healthy. It sounded like growth. The first time something felt off was during a small disagreement. Nothing major, just a misunderstanding about plans. I explained my side calmly, expecting we'd move on. Instead, Jason went quiet for a moment, then said my reaction reminded him of something from his past. He said he had seen this pattern before. I felt a little defensive, but brushed it off. After that, it started happening more. Anytime I disagreed with him or expressed frustration, he'd connect it to his history. He'd say things like this was familiar or this brought up old dynamics for him. Somehow, my present feelings were always tied to his past. He talked a lot about being misunderstood. If I challenged his behavior, he'd say people always misread his intentions. If I asked him to explain something, he'd say he struggled to feel safe being open because of past experiences. conversations started feeling like emotional minefields. I noticed that whenever I brought up an issue, the focus shifted quickly. Instead of talking about what he did, we'd end up discussing how my reaction affected him. He'd explain how it triggered feelings from before. I found myself apologizing more than I expected. Jason framed himself as sensitive. He said harsh reactions affected him deeply. He said tone mattered more than words. I started softening everything I said, choosing phrases carefully, avoiding topics that might upset him. There was one night we were sitting in his living room, lights low, just talking. I mentioned feeling uneasy about something he had said earlier. He listened quietly, then sighed and said it hurt that I assumed the worst of him. He said he thought I understood him better than that. I felt guilty immediately. After that, I questioned my instincts. If something felt off, I wondered if I was being unfair. If I felt hurt, I worried I was contributing to his feeling misunderstood. It felt like my emotions always needed translation through his perspective. He often talked about emotional intelligence, about how people needed to reflect on why they reacted the way they did. When I pushed back, he'd say he wasn't blaming me, just encouraging reflection. It sounded reasonable, but it left me feeling like I was always the one needing to adjust. Friends started noticing I hesitated before answering questions, like I was choosing words carefully even in casual conversation. When they asked about Jason, I said he was sensitive. Saying it out loud felt like an explanation and an excuse at the same time. The pressure built slowly. I started feeling anxious bringing up concerns. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to be another person who misunderstood him. So I stayed quiet more often than not. The moment that really stuck with me happened during a walk one evening. I mentioned feeling disconnected lately. Jason stopped walking and told me that hearing that made him feel like he was failing, which connected to a long history of feeling inadequate. He talked for a while about how painful that pattern was for him. By the end, I forgot what I had even been trying to say. I realized then that every issue somehow turned into a story about him, not in an obvious way, not narcissistic, just quietly redirecting. My feelings were always acknowledged, but only long enough to be reframed. When I finally told him I felt like I couldn't express frustration without it becoming about his past, he looked genuinely hurt. He said he couldn't separate the two, that his experiences shaped how he processed things. He said asking him to ignore that was asking him to be less himself. That sentence made me pause. I wasn't asking him to ignore his past. I was asking to talk about the present. But somehow that request felt unreasonable in the way he framed it. Arguments became draining, not loud or explosive, just long, emotionally detailed. He'd analyze everything, my tone, my timing, my wording. If I got tired and wanted to stop, he'd say unresolved conversations lingered and caused distance. There was a night when I told him I needed a break from talking. He sent a long message explaining how silence triggered feelings of abandonment for him. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling trapped between needing space and being responsible for his emotional state. I started feeling like I was walking on emotional glass. One wrong step and I'd be accused of not understanding him, not seeing him, not appreciating how hard he tried. The breaking point came quietly. I tried to explain once again that I felt like my feelings didn't have room to exist on their own. He listened, then said it sounded like I was repeating patterns from my own past. He suggested I reflect on why I struggle to hold space for someone else's emotions. Something snapped then, not anger, clarity. I realized that no matter how carefully I spoke, it would always come back to me needing to change, needing to reflect more, needing to grow. When I told him I couldn't continue the relationship, he looked shocked. He said he thought we were working through things. He said leading felt like giving up. He said he hoped I wouldn't add him to the list of people who misunderstood him. That guilt almost pulled me back. Almost. But I remembered how small I had started to feel, how often my feelings were paused or redirected, how tired I was. After we stopped talking, the silence felt heavy at first. I kept expecting messages explaining things, clarifying, reframing. When they didn't come, I felt relief mixed with sadness. It took time to trust my reactions again, to say something bothered me without immediately questioning why, to feel frustrated without analyzing it to death. Jason probably still sees himself as deeply misunderstood. Maybe he is, but I learned that being sensitive doesn't mean never being questioned. And self-awareness doesn't mean every conflict has to turn into a reflection exercise. Sometimes things are just hurtful. Sometimes feelings just need space. And sometimes understanding someone shouldn't come at the cost of understanding yourself. The memory that always comes back first isn't a big moment. It's me sitting on the floor of my closet, back against the wall, phone in my hand, scrolling through old messages trying to figure out where things shifted. My clothes were piled around me because I had been cleaning and stopped halfway through. I remember thinking how quiet the apartment felt, like the air was holding its breath. That was the first time I admitted to myself that being with Natalie had started to feel lonelier than being alone. I met Natalie in a place I'd never expected to meet anyone. A late afternoon class that everyone complained about. The kind where people showed up half awake, sat wherever, and left as soon as they could. She sat a few rows ahead of me and always turned around to talk to people behind her. She laughed easily, asked questions, made jokes about the class being pointless. When she started talking to me, it felt natural, like we already knew each other. We started walking together after class, just casually at first, talking about random stuff, sharing snacks, complaining about assignments. Natalie was warm, affectionate in a soft way. She touched my arm when she laughed, leaned in when I talked. It made me feel nervous, chosen. I hadn't realized how much I wanted that until it happened. When we started seeing each other more intentionally, it felt easy. She was attentive, thoughtful. She'd remember things I said and bring them up later. She'd text just to check in. Nothing overwhelming. Just enough to feel connected. I remember thinking this is what it's supposed to feel like. The first sign something was off was how her affection shifted depending on the situation. When things were light and fun, she was all in. Playful messages. Warm energy. When I was stressed or quiet, she pulled back. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Everyone has moods. Everyone needs space sometimes. But it kept happening. If I talked about being overwhelmed, her responses got shorter. If I needed reassurance, she'd say she didn't have the emotional capacity right then. She framed it as self-care. She talked a lot about protecting her energy, about not overextending herself emotionally. She said she had learned the hard way that giving too much drained her. I wanted to respect that. I didn't want to be someone who took too much. So I adjusted. When I had a bad day, I downplayed it. When something bothered me, I waited until it passed. When I needed comfort, I told myself I could handle it on my own. Natalie seemed happier when I did that. More affectionate, more present. The imbalance crept in quietly. When she was upset, I showed up fully. I listened, reassured, stayed late. When I was upset, she needed space, time, distance. She'd say she couldn't hold heavy emotions right now. I told myself relationships aren't always equal in every moment. There was a night we were supposed to hang out, but I told her I was feeling low and might not be great company. She replied saying she didn't feel emotionally available to handle that kind of energy. She suggested rescheduling. I sat on my bed staring at the message, feeling like I had failed some invisible requirement. After that, I stopped mentioning when I felt low. I became the easy version of myself. Jokes, updates, surface-level conversations. Natalie responded well to that. She was affectionate again, attentive. It was hard not to connect the dots. Friends started noticing I never talked about my feelings anymore. I laughed it off, said I was fine. But inside it felt like I was carrying everything quietly so I wouldn't lose her warmth. I tried bringing it up once, carefully. I told her I sometimes felt like my feelings were too much for her. She looked surprised and said that wasn't true. She said she just needed to manage her emotional limits. She said I needed to respect that. Somehow, the conversation ended with me apologizing for putting pressure on her. I walked home feeling confused. I wasn't asking her to fix anything. I just wanted to be heard. Her distance always came wrapped in calm language. She'd say she was practicing boundaries, that she needed to recharge, that she couldn't pour from an empty cup. All reasonable things, but it always seemed to happen when I needed her. There was a moment that really stuck with me. We were sitting together on the couch, close but not touching. I mentioned feeling disconnected lately. She sighed softly and said she didn't have the capacity for heavy conversations that night. She said maybe we could talk another time. Then she picked up her phone and scrolled. I sat there feeling invisible. After that, I stopped initiating deeper talks. I didn't want to be another demand on her energy. I became careful, quiet, supportive without expecting support back. I didn't realize how much that was costing me. The affection became conditional. When I was upbeat, she was warm. When I was quiet, she was distant. It wasn't punishment. It was absence. And somehow that hurt more. I started feeling anxious about my own emotions. If I felt sad, I worried it would push her away. If I felt frustrated, I swallowed it. I became afraid of being anything but easy. The breaking point didn't come during a fight. It came during a moment that should have been comforting. I had a rough week and finally told her I needed support. She listened briefly, then said she was overwhelmed and needed to focus on herself. She said she hoped I understood. I nodded, and I always nodded. But later that night, alone in my apartment, something shifted. I realized I couldn't remember the last time she had stayed with me in discomfort. The last time she had held space for my feelings the way I held space for hers. When I tried to talk about it again, she said she felt like I was asking her to abandon her boundaries. She said she couldn't be responsible for someone else's emotional stability. That sentence stayed with me. I wasn't asking her to be responsible for me. I was asking her to be present. The distance grew after that. Messages slowed. Plans became tentative. When we did see each other, things felt polite, careful, like we were avoiding something fragile. Ending it felt inevitable, even though I didn't want to admit it. When I finally told her I didn't feel supported, she looked sad but calm. She said she thought I understood her limits better than that. She said she needed someone more emotionally independent. After we stopped talking, the quiet felt heavy at first. I kept expecting her to reach out when things got hard. Then I realized she never really had. It took time to let myself feel again without fear of being too much, to talk to friends honestly, to say I'm not okay and not apologize for it. I still think Natalie believed she was doing the right thing. She talked a lot about self-care and boundaries. Those things matter, but I learned that connection can't survive if only one person is allowed to need. Sometimes love isn't loud or cruel. Sometimes it's just absent when you reach for it. I was on a bus that smelled like damp seats and old air when I realized I felt tense for no reason. I wasn't late. No one was texting me. Nothing bad was happening. But my shoulders were tight and my jaw hurt from clenching. I stared out the window watching streets blur together and thought about Kevin and how every decision lately felt like it needed approval even when no one was asking for it. That was the moment I knew something was wrong, even if I couldn't explain it yet. I met Kevin at a friend's game night that barely counted as one. 3 people showed up. The rules got ignored halfway through, and everyone mostly talked over each other. Kevin was calm in the middle of it. Observant, he didn't talk much at first. When he did, people listened. He had this quiet confidence that made him seem steady, like someone who had things figured out. We started talking after that. Messages at first, then hanging out. Kevin liked discussions. Not arguments, discussions. He talked about compromise like it was an art form. He said relationships were about meeting in the middle, about flexibility. It sounded mature, grown, especially compared to people who avoided conflict entirely. Early on, he praised me for being open-minded. He said not everyone could adjust their perspective when needed. I liked that he saw that in me. It made me feel capable, like I could handle adult relationships. The first time compromise came up in a way that stuck with me was small. We were deciding where to eat. I suggested a place. He paused, then said he wanted to see how flexible I was. He smiled when he said it like it was a joke. I laughed and picked somewhere else. It felt harmless. After that, little tests started appearing everywhere. Plans, opinions, preferences. Kevin would suggest one thing, then subtly push the opposite. If I agreed easily, he'd nod approvingly. If I hesitated, he'd ask why. He framed it as curiosity, as wanting to understand my thinking. He talked a lot about emotional intelligence, about not being rigid, about how compromise showed maturity. Whenever I stood my ground on something small, he'd say it was interesting how attached I was to it. Not judgmental, just observational, but it made me feel self-conscious. I started giving in more often, not because I didn't care, but because it felt easier. Kevin noticed. He'd say things like, "See, that's what growth looks like." I felt proud and uneasy at the same time. Arguments never felt like arguments. They felt like evaluations. Kevin stayed calm, almost relaxed, while explaining why flexibility mattered. If I got frustrated, he pointed out as resistance. He said resistance blocked connection. There was a moment that really stands out. We were talking about a boundary I wanted to set around time. I needed more alone time than he did. He listened, nodded, then said relationships require sacrifice. He asked how willing I was to adjust. The question felt loaded, like there was a right answer. I started second-guessing my needs, wondering if wanting space meant I was selfish. Kevin framed compromise as a measure of emotional intelligence. If I struggled, it meant I needed to work on myself. He never demanded anything outright. He just watched, observed, noted how far I'd bend. When I did, he praised it. When I didn't, he'd say we had different levels of flexibility. Friends noticed I'd stopped voicing opinions. When they asked where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do, I shrugged. Choosing felt stressful. I didn't want to be inflexible. There was a night when I was exhausted and didn't want to hang out. Kevin said he understood, then asked if I could push through it for the sake of connection. I went anyway. I didn't want to fail another test. I didn't realize how much I was bending until I felt like I had no shape left. Everything I did felt adjustable, negotiable. Nothing felt solid. The breaking point came quietly. I finally said no to something that mattered to me. Kevin looked at me for a long moment, then said he was disappointed. He said he thought I was more emotionally intelligent than that. That sentence hurt more than anything else he had said. It turned my boundary into a flaw. I went home that night feeling hollow, like I had been trying to prove something that kept moving further away. I thought about how compromise had turned into expectation, how flexibility had turned into pressure. Ending it was hard, not because I loved him deeply, but because I doubted myself. I wondered if I was being rigid, if I was giving up instead of growing. Kevin had a way of making doubt sound logical. When I finally told him I couldn't keep doing this, he nodded calmly. He said he hoped I'd reflect on why compromise felt so hard for me. That was it. No argument, no apology. After we stopped talking, it took time to feel solid again, to say no without explaining myself, to want something without negotiating it first. I still believe compromise matters, but I learned that when one person decides how much bending counts as growth, it stops being shared. It becomes a test you're always meant to fail. The first time I felt embarrassed around Sophie wasn't in public, which is what still surprises me. It was in my car, parked crooked outside my place, engine ticking as it cooled down. I had just said something honest without thinking, the kind of thing you say when you're tired and not trying to impress anyone. Sophie laughed, not loudly, just a short breath through her nose, and said I was being dramatic. She smiled right after, like it was playful. I smiled back, even though my face felt hot. I didn't realize that moment would become a pattern. I met Sophie during a random stretch of weeks where I was going out more than usual. Not partying, just saying yes to things so I wouldn't feel stuck. A friend dragged me to a small art show in a converted warehouse. Concrete floors, folding tables, sheep lights strung everywhere. Sophie stood near one of the displays, talking confidently to someone about boundaries and self-respect. I noticed people listening. When she spoke, it sounded like she had already decided what was right. We were introduced casually. Sophie shook my hand firmly and looked me straight in the eye. She asked questions that felt bold, like she expected honest answers. When I joked something away, she raised an eyebrow and said I didn't need to minimize myself. It caught me off guard in a good way. I remember thinking she was refreshing. We started talking after that. Long conversations that jumped between topics fast. Sophie had strong opinions about everything. Relationships, respect, communication. She talked about boundaries like they were essential for survival. She said people who didn't understand boundaries weren't emotionally evolved. I nodded along. It all sounded right. Our early hangouts felt intense but exciting. Sophie didn't like small talk. She wanted real conversations. She asked what made me uncomfortable, what I struggled with, what I avoided. When I answered honestly, she smiled like I had passed some test. She said she appreciated authenticity. The first time I felt uncomfortable, I didn't say anything. I had mentioned feeling overwhelmed by something small, and Sophie laughed and said I was overthinking it. She said discomfort was part of growth. She said people who avoided discomfort stayed stagnant. I didn't want to sound weak, so I let it go. After that, she started framing things that bothered me as resistance. If I hesitated about something, she'd say I was avoiding growth. If I didn't like a joke she made, she'd say I needed to work on my triggers. It always came wrapped in this calm, confident tone, like she was helping me. Sophie talked a lot about mutual respect, but her version of it seemed one-sided. She encouraged me to push past my comfort zones, but when I asked her to ease up on something, she said I was trying to limit her expression. She said real connection required discomfort. I noticed that when I tried to set boundaries, she mocked them lightly. Not outright, just enough to make me feel silly. She'd say things like, "You're so rigid," or "You'll loosen up eventually." She laughed when she said it, like it was harmless. I laughed too, even when I didn't want to. Friends started noticing changes in me before I did. They said I sounded unsure of myself, that I kept questioning my reactions. When I told them about Sophie, I framed it like she was helping me grow. Saying it out loud made it sound convincing. There was a night we were hanging out at her place, sitting on the floor because she said furniture created unnecessary distance. I mentioned feeling uncomfortable with something she had said earlier. Sophie tilted her head and smiled like she was curious. Then she said discomfort didn't mean something was wrong. She said it meant something was being challenged. Somehow, the conversation ended with me apologizing for reacting instead of her apologizing for hurting me. I didn't even realize how it happened. She hugged me and said she was proud of me for being open to feedback. Feedback. That word started to show up a lot. She gave feedback on my tone, my reactions, my boundaries. She said it was all about mutual improvement, but I noticed she never took feedback herself. When I tried, she'd say she didn't receive criticism well from people who hadn't done the same work. I started feeling like I was constantly being evaluated, like my growth was under review. If I expressed discomfort, it was a chance to improve. If I pushed back, it meant I wasn't ready. There was no version of no that didn't get reframed. The worst part was how confident she sounded. Sophie spoke like someone who had read every book, watched every talk, figured everything out. When she said something, it felt authoritative. Disagreeing with her made me feel uninformed. There was an argument that really stuck with me. We were talking about boundaries again. I said I needed certain things to feel safe. Sophie laughed and said safety was overrated. She said people hid behind safety to avoid growth. She said love required discomfort. I remember sitting there feeling small, like my need for comfort was something embarrassing, like wanting gentleness meant I wasn't strong enough. After that, I stopped bringing things up. I didn't want another lecture about growth. I didn't want my feelings turned into a lesson. I started choosing silence over being corrected. Sophie noticed. She said I seemed quieter. She said she hoped I wasn't regressing. That word hit hard, regressing, like having needs meant moving backward. The breaking point came during a moment that should have been simple. I told her I didn't like a joke she made about me in front of others. She rolled her eyes and said I needed thicker skin. She said if I couldn't handle teasing, I wasn't ready for real connection. Something snapped then, not anger, clarity. I realized that respect shouldn't feel like humiliation. That growth shouldn't feel like constant discomfort. That boundaries shouldn't be something you're mocked for. When I tried to explain that, she sighed and said I was being rigid again. She said I was choosing comfort over connection. She said she couldn't dim herself for someone else's insecurities. I went home that night feeling embarrassed for staying as long as I did. I replayed conversations in my head, realizing how often I had laughed things off that hurt, how often I had apologized for reacting. Ending things was messy emotionally, but not dramatic. When I told her I couldn't continue, she said she wasn't surprised. She said people often leave when they're confronted with themselves. She said she hoped I'd do the work eventually. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I was too tired. After we stopped talking, I felt raw for a while, like my confidence had been scraped down slowly without me noticing. It took time to trust my reactions again, to believe that discomfort isn't always growth and that boundaries don't make you weak. I still think about how convincing Sophie was, how easy it was to confuse confidence with correctness, how language about respect and growth can be twisted into something sharp. I don't think Sophie saw herself as cruel. I think she believed she was honest. But I learned that honesty without care isn't honesty at all.